You're not very pretty, and you're not very bright.
I'm so glad we had that talk.
Hello again, and welcome back to the series. I'm your host, and today we're going to be looking at Cinderella, Disney Animation's 1950 return to fairy tale storytelling, and their second princess after Snow White. This script was written by Gladys.
I do, however, have a head. It's attached to my body, it is me.
So thank you, Gladys.
It'll still be me.
If you're new here, welcome for the first time of, I hope, many. And if you're returning, I thank you once again for your continued patronage. Now sit back, relax, and let's get into this together. Today is a special treat, and it's something that I'm going to be trying out on the channel from time to time here and there. I'm joined by my friend Darren, who really loves this movie, and who's going to give us some of his own thoughts during the review. I'm going to sprinkle them in their own sections, during the sections. And yeah, Darren and I had a call the other day. I basically sort of interviewed him about his thoughts on the film, then we had a nice discussion, and we touched on a few different topics, and I may repeat myself from what I've written in the script in the conversation, but I'll try not to overlap too much, and we'll just have some guest thoughts, have a guest speaker, and we'll see what you think. And so everybody welcome Darren, friend of the channel, whenever his segments pop up. First of all, welcome to the channel. Say hello to the viewers.
Yes, hello viewers.
Cinderella was the sixth full-length single-narrative film from Disney Animation, and their 12th theatrical release overall. Out of those six, it was only the second, and the first since Snow White, to be based on a fairy tale, the particular type of source material that Disney Animation has since become inextricably entangled with. Throughout the 1940s and the package film era that his company was enjoying/enduring, it had always been Walt's plan to return to full single-narrative filmmaking as soon as the company was financially able to. While The Adventures of Ichabod and Mr. Toad hadn't made quite as big of a splash at the box office as Disney would have preferred, the six theatrical releases of the package/wartime era had made enough that Disney felt comfortable going full steam ahead finally on another full-length animated feature, heading into the new decade of the 1950s.
A wave of the hand and presto, down comes a hidden cabinet with the dishes. Mama will feel like a fairy princess with a magic wand in a place like this. We won't be able to get her out of the kitchen.
Charles Perrault's 1697 French fairy tale Cinderella was a story that Walt had had his eye on adapting since at least 1922, when he had first developed a silent short version of it for the Laugh-O-Gram studio that we mentioned all the way back in the introduction to the Snow White video. He next attempted an adaptation in 1933 as part of his Silly Symphony Shorts series of cartoons, and the project began to slowly acquire more and more of the finer details, this period having added, among other things, birds and white mice in the initial story treatments as Cinderella's playmates, an element that would more or less end up in the final product. Around this period, several visual gags were suggested by story artists that were also able to work their way into the finished movie over a decade later. By 1938, however, the story had expanded to become far too unwieldy for the Silly Symphony Shorts format. It was decided then that the Cinderella project had enough potential to be expanded into a full-length feature, and the first somewhat full-length story treatment was written at this time by Al Perkins. It was 14 pages, but still. 2 years later, a second treatment of the script was done, this one much longer, and hewing far closer to the original Perrault tale than the eventual 1950 movie would. By 1943, Disney had assigned artists Dick Huemer and Joe Grant to be story supervisors on Cinderella, and had given the project an initial budget of $1 million.
$1 million.
However, by 1945, work had been halted on the project due to various factors, including the war, the inaccessibility of European film markets, and the company's focus shifting entirely from narrative features to package films and shorts, until they were out of the financial hole that they'd initially dug for themselves with the double financial bomb releases of Pinocchio and Fantasia all the way back in 1940. In the spring of 1946, Walt held 3 story meetings, and based on these meetings, he was given yet another treatment of the script on March 24, 1947, worked on by Ted Sears, Homer Brightman, and Harry Reeves. 2 months later, in May 1947, the first rough phase of storyboarding had begun its process, and an inventory report that same month suggested a different approach, with the story told largely through the animals in the barnyard and their observations of Cinderella's day-to-day activities, an element that would more or less, with the mouse's roles expanded later on, remain consistent in the final product. As well as Cinderella, around this time, Disney was also actively developing both Alice in Wonderland and Peter Pan, which would go on to be the 2 releases following this film in 1951 and 53. However, Walt himself firmly believed that Cinderella was the best story of the 3 to return Disney animation to full narratives. By early 1948, Cinderella had progressed further than Alice in Wonderland, and was fast-tracked to become their first full-length one-story feature since Bambi. During a story meeting on January 15, 1948, the cat and mouse sequences began to grow into an important element in the film, so much so that Disney placed veteran story artist Bill Peet in charge of the cat and mouse segments. Of course, as I think I've mentioned before, and I will mention many times in the future in scripts at least, Bill Peet is one of my favorite artists of all time, one of my favorite Disney artists ever, and I own basically every single one of the books he ever wrote. He wrote wonderful children's books that he illustrated himself, and they often rhymed, they were often poetic, and they're just fantastic. I'll show you some on screen right now, and I'll show you some of the physical ones I have eventually in person, but they're amazing. Rest in Pete to Bill Peet.
Strike that. Reverse it. This way, please.
Just as Walter had envisioned and hoped, the movie was a massive critical and financial success, with the visuals, music, and overall magic all being praised effusively, and with many critics saying that it was Disney's greatest achievement since Snow White. Although the initial budget of $1 million had more than doubled to a far more daunting $2.2 million, the film earned $4.28 million back at the initial North American box office, becoming the 5th highest grossing North American release of 1950. In addition, through various re-releases, the movie has earned a global all-time box office return of $182 million, without adjusting for inflation. This, along with Frozen and Pocahontas, has always been one of my trilogy of least personally enjoyed Disney princess movies. That was before Raya and the Last Dragon, of course. We'll get to it eventually. It's fine.
This is fine. I'm okay with the events that are unfolding currently.
Anyway, I was excited to watch this one again finally, for the first time in over 5 years, and for only the second time ever as an adult, and fully reevaluate it. And then the other day I watched it another time, so for a third time as an adult, just to be sharp with the script. The opening feels rushed, I will say, a little like the opening to Frozen, but without a fun transition song like they have in that film. There's a lot of little connections to Frozen, honestly, especially at certain moments visually in this movie too, but I'll be mentioning Frozen a few times, especially in a second. The animation budget is obviously being saved a little bit here, as I'll get into more later. This is a short movie overall, and fairly simply done compared to what would come after it in the 1950s. I'll get into the animation more in the dedicated section, but it's still animated well, almost like a storybook for a lot of the runtime, with just little bits of movement added here and there. Eileen Woods is immediately charming as Cinderella. Her voice is warm and mature. Cinderella is, with Elsa, the oldest Disney princess in story in their original films, and Eileen sounds much more like a mature 21-year-old than did Idina Menzel in either Frozen film. It helps that Eileen was literally 21 years old at the time of the movie's release, having been born in 1929, I believe. A dream as a wish your heart makes is sung beautifully, which I'll talk more about later, and I love how Cinderella is described as being just naturally mellow. She's an abuse victim, and that's awful, but beyond that already sympathetic situation, she just seems like such a solid lady. Such a genuinely nice and sweet person, which makes her even more immediately sympathetic to us. Eileen Wood's vocal work is enrapturing as Cinderella, both speaking and singing. Of that there is no debate. She won the role after being the demo singer on the tracks that the songwriters originally recorded to play for Walt Disney himself, after they had heard and enjoyed her on the radio. Disney then apparently loved the voice of Eileen on the demos so much that he called her up immediately and offered her the lead role on the spot. She was surprised but overjoyed to have won the part over 300 plus other women who had actually auditioned.
You weren't a part.
The singing of her mice friends, however, will have varying mileage. This is essentially the first example that I can find, in pop culture at least, of the use of the Alvin and the Chipmunk style, sped up, cute rodent singing voice effect, and I'm not sure how much I love it in this movie or in general. This certainly is not the worst example of it. Yeah, I'm not sure, I can't quite verify that, but I can't find any earlier examples of this technique being used, or at least this sort of sped up voice being used to communicate rodents speaking. Alvin and the Chipmunks started doing it like 8 years later. David Seville started doing it, but he's sort of credited as pioneering the technique, but this was 8 years earlier than that. And it might be a different technique, but it's certainly an extremely similar effect. So I don't know who the pioneers were, but it's very cool that they pioneered some sound editing techniques in this movie, something that really hadn't been heard in a while. And I think that makes the mice a little easier to take, even if you don't like them. The knowledge that like they were very novel at the time, sort of like even their voices were something that the audiences hadn't really heard before much. It was 1950. And the other thing that's novel in this movie, the sound design, I was going to talk about this in the music section, but whatever, I'll talk about it here because it has to do with Eileen, is the way that in the Sing Sweet Nightingale sequence, when it goes down from Drizella singing to Cinderella singing when she's cleaning the floor, that was apparently either the first or one of the first times that overdubbing had been used for a singer to create a harmonies with themselves effect. At least it seemed to be that this was one of the first times that had been used. Maybe not the first ever, but a very, very early example of overdubbing, and overdubbing done really well so that Eileen could harmonize with herself and create this sort of magical musical effect for her voice. And I love that. I think that's incredible. So this movie's music and its sound recording and sound editing and sound techniques are extremely innovative, I would say, and pioneering, at least in a couple of ways. If not the first to do them really, really well. So, cool. Speaking of Cinderella and the mice, both of them, both of their singing, I love how Cinderella takes care of the mice. The mice themselves aren't my favorite, but the way she interacts with them is very sweet. Despite her abusive environment, this is her own little world, and similar to Snow White with the dwarfs, Cinderella is naturally and effortlessly maternal. And even Aurora with her aunts, honestly, because like they take care of her, but she definitely takes care of them too, and it's very sweet. So all of these three original princesses are maternal in their own way, even though they're also representations of youth and newness. They're also very maternal, subtly or overtly, and I think that's kind of lovely in its own way. I think it's cool. The themes are well represented, in my opinion. Being able to communicate with animals more easily than those around them is a core trait of Disney princesses, as it is exhibited as an ability in some way, shape, or form by, at the very least, Snow White, Cinderella, Aurora, Pocahontas, Jasmine, Ariel, Mulan, Tiana, Rapunzel, Moana, and Raya. And also Kristoff, if we're counting princes. Having said that, Cinderella is perhaps the single most in tune with the animals around her of any Disney princesses when put up against the other humans around her and how they interact or not with animals. She is super duper keyed in. She essentially has full conversations with them. Even before the magical elements of her movie have begun, Cinderella is having quite complex communications with these mice, and that definitely raises her princess score for me and is also just a cool feature of the character. There are a lot of animals in this movie. It's almost a test run for their big run of anthropomorphic or of human intelligence animals movies in the 1960s and 70s, starting with 101 Dalmatians in 1961. It's interesting too, I actually do have a documented test that is sort of the criteria for a princess, because there's the official criteria for a princess that I know, but then there's the common traits of princesses, and I was able to isolate sort of 6 elements that are common to the princess characters, and then I sort of administered that test to other characters who weren't official princesses, like Kita or like Jane, for instance, and if they got as high or higher of a score than the lowest score of any of the official princesses, which was Jasmine, and I think she got like a 6 out of a possible 12 points. So if anybody got a 6 or higher out of 12, then I thought, or Megara, somebody like that they should be an official Disney princess. You know, just if they're in that sort of role but aren't granted that because, I don't know, their movie didn't do that well, or their movie wasn't with them in the lead, or whatever silly factor keeps them from not being counted as an official Disney princess. I like to just sort of have a criteria of both the official stuff and then my own added onto that, and it's sort of 12 points. And I think it's kind of fun. I'll do a video about that eventually, because I know a lot about Disney princesses, because I'm a nerd.
Gay!
All right, that's all done. No more Princess First for now. But I do love talking about the princesses, my lord. It's fun. It's such a fun lineage. It's so cool. I love artistic lineages like this that aren't exactly, oh, this is a sequel to this is a sequel to this, but that are, you know, of a piece. It's awesome. Eileen did truly remarkable and timeless work in this role, really making us care for this adorable and sympathetic character, imbuing her with a quiet strength that is still inspiring to this day. She built upon the already towering legacy of Adriana Caselotti as the then second ever in the now long line of great Disney princesses. If the performances of these original 3 actresses were not as entirely magical and enchanting as they ended up being, the Disney princess concept and brand might never have become the global cultural juggernaut that it is in the present day. Using the spell that Eileen's timeless voice cast, Cinderella took her place in the Disney pantheon as one of the most influential, archetypal, and of course, iconic princess characters that they have ever produced. Cinderella is the first truly adult princess character that we ever got, since Snow White was 14 in canon, and, you know, on the verge in the Middle Ages of sort of becoming an adult, but it's kind of the journey she goes on. And the maturity in her voice, and the measured way with which she speaks, is dignified and charming, without ever losing her youthful hope and resilience. Similar to Snow White or Quasimodo, Cinderella is a character whose beauty comes through in her kind treatment of others, despite the abuse she has had to constantly endure. Hers is a tale not of questing for adventure and being brash and heroic. Instead, Cinderella is a story of true goodness, true kindness, and true virtue being rewarded in the end. Before I get on to the other full sections, I will say there is a lot of what I would call mouse nonsense in this movie, for lack of a better, not more effusively vulgar phrase. I don't want to swear here, but my lord. I will probably keep harping on this topic a lot throughout this D.E.A.R, but yes, indeed, the overabundance of mouse nonsense is quite egregious in this film, and just makes over a third of the movie feel like a Disney-fied Tom and Jerry short. However, one thing this does do is make this little world of awful humans and fun, silly animals that Cinderella inhabits each day feel real and magical. On the other hand, it makes a movie that is already barely 74 minutes long feel like an extended short rather than a feature-length princess film. Side note about Lucifer the cat before we move on from the animals for a while. A 33-year-old June Foray of Rocky and Bullwinkle fame provided the vocal work for Lucifer the cat. Many years later, at age 81 in 1998, she voiced Grandmother Fa in Mulan, making these 48 years easily the longest gap that I could find, at least, in between providing vocal work in 2 Disney animated classics. Beating out so far what I can find is the second place, which was Basil Rathbone that we talked about last week.
Hurry, Bullwinkle! The show's about to start!
Oh, I'm coming as fast as I can.
Wave to the people!
For the role of Lucifer, a studio representative asked Foray if she could provide the voice of a cat. Well, I could do anything, recalled Foray. So he hired me as Lucifer the cat in Cinderella. Nice. June was cool. The story of this film is definitely one of its weaker areas. The biggest problem is obviously the incredibly uneven ratio of screen time given to the mice versus Cinderella. Yes, alright, we're back to the mice. And how this really starts to negatively impact the ability for the actual main story to keep up its momentum. Several times during the film, especially in the dressmaking sequence, the story proper feels like it veers completely off course to just follow the mice around for several minutes. This would be far less insane, perhaps, if the dress they ended up making for her were the one she ended up wearing to the ball, but it was obviously the one that her stepsisters tear up before her fairy godmother appears. The fact that the dress the mice make ultimately ends up being the one that gets destroyed makes the many minutes we spend following them, gathering the materials, feel that much more like just a lot of filler, and time that could have been far better spent further developing the character of Cinderella. The first half hour ends up being very laid back, with Cinderella just going about her day, interacting with the animals, and avoiding her stepfamily. I love the characters of Cinderella and the dynamic of the home. It's an unflinching and at times bizarrely accurate vision of domestic abuse, and I think that this is where the strength in the story lies. Rather than a larger-than-life story about attempted murder like Snow White or Sleeping Beauty, Cinderella is far more an attempt at an intimate character study and an exploration of the dynamics of a domestically abusive relationship than it is a particularly exciting or gripping narrative. One of the biggest general gripes about this movie is how thinly Prince Charming is portrayed, Prince Henry, retroactively, and I have to, for the most part, agree with these critiques. While there's nothing wrong with him, we could definitely have done with a bit more of the prince in terms of both screen time and characterization. We would eventually get two much more fleshed out portrayals of this prince in both Cinderella 3, A Twist in Time, and in the live action Cinderella remake with Lily James in 2015. Here, however, in the story of the 1950 version, the prince serves his purpose, but much like the prince in Snow White, Prince Florian, he offers little narratively beyond a handsome visage to be enamored by and a charming, lovely voice.
That's a very good point when you mentioned about the king and the duke, whatever his name is that's the other thing is I was surprised how much the comedy, at least for me, really worked in this movie. Like, a lot of the Disney comedies, and you know, I think, maybe I'll just tell the viewers, like, comedy is my least favorite genre. So that's always a genre that when someone, like, you know, whether it's in animated movies or in anything, when someone says, you know, what do you think about this film and it's a comedy, I always kind of say you should go to someone else, because it doesn't mean I can't appreciate comedies and that there isn't great comedies out there. It's just, for whatever reason, comedy is always the one that lands least with me. So because of that, it's even more impressive that in this film, like, some of it doesn't land, but overall, it's a very funny movie, and I wasn't expecting that, or at least I didn't remember that. And especially from the king and the duke or whoever it is, it's really funny. And even the mice, because I know the mice is the kind of the thing where we somewhat disagree on. I don't mean to say that everything about the mice works, but I think the reason that it works at all is because there's a lot of sequences with the mice and the cat, Lucifer, which, by the way, what an amazing name for a cat. Like, that is just, like, phenomenal. But with the mice and the cat, Lucifer, I think there's a lot of just really comedic, like, there's good comedic parts to it that, even though I agree it does kind of linger on that storyline a bit too much, it still worked enough that I wasn't going like I think I would have been for other movies, going, okay, come on, let's go, Disney, like, enough with the mice. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's one of those things that either works for you or it doesn't, or partially works for you. It's just a degree thing. It's like, it's a choice. But that's the thing, is that how much does that work for you? How much does, basically a comic side plot involving essentially Tom and Jerry type hijinks, which is fine. It's the exact same era, basically. How much does that work for you? And me being somebody who, I like that sort of thing, fine, but I am such a, like, princess head, very obviously. Like, I'm just so into these characters and these, like, very specific emotional journeys involving these lead characters that, even though those scenes are fine, and I'm fine with them, every time I'm in one for too long, I just want to go back to Cinderella.
No, and I agree with you, and that's why I would say that A, as we said at the beginning, it's not one of their masterpieces, and two, it's one of the reasons why I would say that I would say it's the main reason that prevents it from being great, or from being, like, at least, like, you know, a 10 out of 10.
With full potential. Maybe.
Exactly, yeah, from reaching its full potential is because of that.
This guy's a real jerk.
Eleanor Audley's voice is just as delicately cutting and deliciously intelligent as the wicked stepmother Lady Tremaine, as it would eventually be 9 years later in Sleeping Beauty. Audley possessed one of those voices that positively drips with confidence, character, and cunning. Only an immensely talented voice actress could pull off two classic mainline Disney villains, and have them both be completely distinct, but also incredibly reminiscent and utterly essential, both part and together, just two perfect villains. As the stepmother here, she effortlessly finds the balance between technical civility, soft speaking, and then the cutting cruelty of subtle domestic abuse and mental manipulations. The animation of the stepmother's facial expressions is also beyond excellent, with tiny little nuances captured over and over, delivering one of the most subtle animated performances in any of these early films. Her microscopic sneers and faintly narrowing eyes are perfectly conveyed to the audience, and are as accurate as they are terrifying. In general, the character of Lady Tremaine is one of Disney's most subtle and effective villains, and she is such a powerful representation of domestic abuse on screen, similar to but far less loving than Mother Gothel would eventually be in Tangled. The animators visually teed her up, but it was up to Eleanor Audley to bring this character home with her vocal performance, and she more than does so. The disturbing way her voice modulates with ease in the bedroom scene, from sickeningly sweet and syrupy to harsh and commanding back and forth, is a perfect representation of the half love bombing, half punishing back and forth nature of a certain type of abuser. It's subtle, it's manipulative, and it's Tremaine's way of continually humiliating Cinderella, putting her back in her place, and keeping the younger woman directly under her thumb. Her subtle manipulation of her daughters into bullying Cinderella, giving them the idea to forcibly strip Cinderella of her beautiful dress before the ball, is all too accurate to real-world abuse of parents, turning children on children, and is brilliantly performed by Audley and animated disturbingly. She obviously takes pleasure in this, and it's sickening. This, along with Tangled and Hunchback, may be Disney's trifecta of great portrayals of domestic abuse. Well, at least when we're able to get a scene of the human characters in between the mice. Ha ha ha, I've mentioned that so many times now, my lord. I don't think that's as funny now as when I wrote it a few months ago, and I hadn't talked about the mice that much, but oh well, it's in there. Lady Tremaine is just such a quietly intimidating presence. She's a perfectly drawn portrait of the sort of domineering maternal figure that's able to perpetrate her brand of subtle abuse. Similar, perhaps, in ways, she's a bit of a precursor to Abuela in Encanto a little bit as well, especially a little bit more visually with the things that she wears, the colors. The animators were also able to translate so well to the screen her luminous eyes, narrowing and widening with such impact and oozing with dramatic emphasis. Lady Tremaine has to be one of the most legitimately intelligent and cunning Disney villains, similar maybe to Claude Frollo again, or Dr. Facilier, or Professor Rattigan. In every scene and situation, she tries everything in her power to accomplish her goals of maneuvering her daughters into a better social position while keeping Cinderella down. And she very nearly succeeds in the end. Right up until she causes the first glass slipper to shatter, she is determined to spite Cinderella, even though Cinderella's good fortune would mean nothing more to her than having to hire a new maid. That is true, pure spite. I love the voices of both Anastasia and Drizella. I didn't put the names of the voice actresses in the script, but I'll flash them up on screen, but they're incredible. Silly and self-unaware without ever being quite too much, just really, really funny. They, in general, just cast voice actors so well in this era of Disney. It's really incredible what they did before they started doing celebrities and everything. Not that the celebrities are bad necessarily, it's just they picked carefully. I'm going to very soon start sounding like a broken record on this topic in future D.E.A.Rs, but the king in this movie is one of the earliest examples of Disney's affection for animating father characters as short, round, silly, and with white mustaches. Short round.
Okie dokie, Dr. Jones, hold on to your potatoes.
The king here would later be joined by Prince Philip's father in Sleeping Beauty, Hubert, I think, Belle's father Maurice in Beauty and the Beast, Jasmine's father the Sultan in Aladdin, Jane's father Mr. What's-his-name in Tarzan, and probably several others that I'm forgetting. The king and the Grand Duke certainly have a lot of character and good comedic chemistry, and I certainly prefer silly scenes with them to silly scenes with the mice. I really love how little self-awareness the king has, and how desperately he wants to meddle in his son's life. Also, I watched the Farsi dub of those scenes with the king and the duke with some Iranian members of my family, and it was very good. I really liked it. You have not seen Cinderella 1950 until you've seen it in the original Farsi, I will say that. I like William Phipps's spoken performance a lot. He did not provide the prince's singing voice, that was the wonderful Mike Douglas. But his voice gives the speaking Prince Charming, or Prince Henry, an impishness that fits with his slightly bored of royal life personality. He only comes alive when he meets Cinderella, and Phipps and Douglas' voices are excellent choices for this fairly brief role, as they match very well. The chase away in the carriage at midnight is fun and lively, but what I really notice is Cinderella's description of the night after the magic is worn off. Wood's vocal performance is so indescribably charming when she's talking about her evening that it elevates the movie by several degrees all on its own. This movie may have some very identifiable and substantial weaknesses, but what it does have is a wonderfully strong and sympathetic main character, brought to life by a gorgeous lead vocal performance from a remarkable young woman. I love how the prince in Cinderella's meeting is actually so understated. We see him approach her, take her hand, bow, and introduce himself. However, we see from a distance from the POV of the king and the Grand Duke. This is a clever flip of the opening to Snow White, where the evil queen witnesses Snow White meeting her prince and looks on in jealousy and rage. In contrast here, the king looks on in hope, rubbing his hands together, optimistic about his romantically uninterested son's prospects of love and of eventual future children and grandchildren for himself. The king's bedroom is gall-darn ridiculous. The fact that he's dreaming about playing horsey ride with his future grandchildren is adorable. I love the king. I also really love that he doesn't care who the prince marries, and is freely letting him choose his own wife. He only cares that the prince does get married as soon as possible, which is fair if you're a king and you're thinking about your line of succession. I adore his comedic scenes with the Grand Duke, another of this movie's biggest pluses. Fairy Godmother is all flouncy, self-assured, and silly. I love her simple but effective design, and the vocal performance is perfection from Verna Felton. She also provides Cinderella with another opportunity to showcase her patient nature with people. I love her little smirking, eye-crinkled shake of her head to the fairy godmother, when the latter finally realizes she's neglected to actually fix Cinderella's gown. The transformation of Cinderella's dress, as we're talking about it, is once again simple but perfectly executed animation, and I'll mention it again later, I'm sure. I will take a special second to talk about Verna Felton here. I'm going to get much more into her in my Sleeping Beauty video that's coming out in a few weeks' time from now, but I will say that Verna Felton is just one of the most legendary, incredible, wonderful, astonishingly memorable, and also malleable and chameleonic voice actors that Disney Animation has ever employed, and I love every single performance she gave them, and they are so gosh darn diverse. From the Queen of Hearts to two different elephants over a decade apart to over 2 decades apart, to Fairy Godmother, to Flora the Fairy. She did it all, and she is incredible. She was incredible. Forever she shall be.
I will say the other thing for me that knocks it down a bit, I don't remember if we've talked about this, but is the character of the stepmother, but specifically the 2 stepsisters. I found that they were, and this is one thing that we can actually mention when it comes to the remake. It's one of the few times we'll be able to say the remake did it better in this way, because in the remake, and I haven't rewatched that yet, but I remember enough to know that because they got Kate Mother effing Blanchett to do the role of the stepmother, and also I don't remember whoever they got to do the role of the stepsisters, but while they still obviously were there for the comedic effect, and it's not like they were incredibly fleshed out, there was still more to them than in this original animated film, whereas in this animated film, they're kind of there just to be annoying. And while I get that that's the purpose that they serve, after a while, and especially when they, for the fifth time, like, go, no, mother, how can you let, like, Cinderella come to the ball? Like, no, and they're whining. I was kind of starting to go, okay, I get it. Can we, like, can we keep going? Like,
I agree. Well, and it's an interesting thing, too, because here's the thing. I actually really like the voices that the actresses did. I think that the voices themselves, just like the way that they sound, are really funny. I think that they did a really good job as comedic voice actors. However, yeah, the way that the characters are written and the way that they're portrayed and the way in which they just kind of do the same thing over and over, that I do find fault with the characterization. But even though I do think the actresses did a really funny work. And the other funny thing to note about that is that in both the remake, I agree, 2015, but also in the two sequels, the two direct-to-video sequels that I'm doing a video on right now, all of the sequels, there's a redemption arc for Anastasia is present in both of those films, and that not only marks a difference between Anastasia and Drizella, but also just deepens Anastasia a lot. And so you actually, in those sequels, you do get a real dynamic between the two of them, where one of them has chosen to be like her mother, and one of them has actually chosen to kind of be more of a decent person and make up for it and become more of a friend to Cinderella. And so across the board, people actually seem to agree that the stepsisters in the original Cinderella are actually the worst they're ever portrayed. So
agree with you, or I guess I won't agree with you. I'll just say, if indeed what you're saying is true, that the stepsisters have more of an arc in the later films, then yeah, I guess I would agree that they're kind of portrayed the worst, quote unquote, here. And I will say that, and I guess it makes sense now when you've been mentioning about how they kind of didn't know how to animate the male characters, like the prince's characters at the beginning. So I was going to say, it was interesting watching it again. I forgot that this was yet another film where the prince isn't really in the movie. Like, you literally see him for I don't know, I think it's I want to say 5 minutes or something like that, or 10 minutes. They're maybe. They're still very cautious with him, yeah. Very cautious with showing him. Well, and that's the thing, though, is that when they do show him, especially the one shot, which is probably the shot that they spent the most money on, when he's smiling as they're dancing and, the camera kind of pans around, I remember looking at that and going, darn, that looks good. Not only, are the teeth so white and, they just both look so happy, but it actually looked... It just looked so good. Whereas, as you said, in the original, or not in the original, in the Snow White, in the earlier film... I don't think it looks bad, and I think for the time it looks really, incredible, considering that it was, basically a new art form that Disney was making. But I can agree with you that definitely you could tell that they were perfecting it more here.
A Dream is a Wish Your Heart Makes is an astonishingly good song. It's got one of the all-time great melodies I've ever heard, and Eileen's work here is just honestly entrancing. It is impossible not to be entirely caught up in the gorgeous emotional wave of this song. Impossible not to fall completely in love with this timeless, hopeful voice. Her performance, the sheer quality of the music, as well as the timeless and wonderful themes of the lyrics, make this one of my favorite ever Disney princess songs. Up there with Once Upon a Dream, many tracks from the Renaissance era, and a few from recent years. I love the transition between Drizella singing upstairs, down to Cinderella singing the same song, but far better, while she cleans the floor. It's a clever piece of editing and storytelling, and serves to further showcase Eileen's gorgeous voice. The entire Sing Sweet Nightingale sequence here, with Cinderella's luminous voice paired with the incredible animation of the bubbles, is one of the standout moments from the entire movie. Yeah, those bubbles animated are just mind-blowingly beautiful. That's one of my favorite Disney images, I think, ever. Close to top 10, wow. It's just stunning. Might be my favorite moment from the movie. One of them. The stepmother and stepsister's if moment reminds me a lot of Pain and Panic, saying almost the same lines in Hercules, and I wonder if that was an intentional homage to this film.
Of course. I said, if.
Oh. If.
You mean if he gets out of there?
If is good.
So This Is Love is a gorgeous number, and I can't believe I'd never given it a close listen until now. The lyrics are, like the rest of this movie, simple but beautifully phrased and effective. The melody and harmonies are equally gorgeous, and the two singers are so subtly and softly skilled in their craft that we can tell, even just by how perfectly their voices match each other's, that this love story is meant to be. We feel the rush of first love right alongside Cinderella, perfectly recalling perhaps our own first foray into romantic entanglement. As much as I am in love with Cinderella's opening song in her bedroom, So This Is Love ended up being my favorite piece of music from the movie. The rest of the songs are fairly cute, with the mice one being okay, and Bibbidi Bobbidi Boo being a very fun little ditty done quite charmingly by Verna.
That whole scene when Cinderella comes into the ball and the prince catches her eye, and then they have that whole like sequence together with the dancing and then the song. Which, by the way, like as much as I do love Cinderella's song at the beginning of the film, obviously, "A Dream Is a Wish Your Heart Makes," which the minute I heard that song again, I was like, this song is so incredible and so like just magical. It's just like it's so good. Again, that one, Once Upon a Dream, and Someday My Prince Will Come. I like, maybe it's just because it's the first one, but those three to me stand so far above like so many of the other like princess songs, at least up until the Renaissance. But with the Renaissance, there wasn't really princess songs as much. Like I guess there kind of was, but there wasn't in the same way. And so, anyways, but what I was saying though is that whole sequence when she comes into the ball and they have their dance, and then that song. As much as I have always known how much I've loved the "A Dream Is a Wish Your Heart Makes," and it is like an incredibly lovely piece, I was really surprised at how much, like, it was so simple and it only lasts like a minute or two, but that song between the two of them, it just shows the like beautiful simplicity with how they told these stories back then. And that isn't to say that there isn't something about in Beauty and the Beast and the later films where there's more like depth and kind of nuance to the characters falling in love. Like that definitely has its place for sure. But there's something about these films when you just see them like it's like boy and girl meet, fall in love, and like, you know, it's love at first sight, and just the way that film or the way that song describes it is yeah, I just loved that moment.
I agree it's beautiful. And well, I would say that So This Is Love, that song, that's easily my favorite. So This Is Love, that's easily my favorite, and that, not easily maybe, because A Dream Is a Wish Your Heart Makes is gorgeous, but that is my favorite, like just a hair above that one. I think it's so exactly what you said. It's so simple and gorgeous and just perfect, as is the animation. It's nothing super flashy, neither super flashy. The music isn't, the animation isn't. It's just, it's technically perfect, but in a very simplistic way. It's just exactly what it needs to be. They didn't try to overdo it. It's just gorgeous, and so it's a moment you just really sink into. And it reminds me of, I think that I'd love to get your thoughts on this, and it's just a short, is the short that opens Make Mine Music, which is Blue Bayou. It's this very gorgeous, it was actually a piece of animation that was meant to be in Fantasia and then was cut, and then they gave it a different piece of music, but it was animation that was meant for Fantasia, so it's really, really, really perfectly done. And I like the song. It's a contemporary 40s song, but it just really reminded me, especially since this is a contemporary feeling 50s song, it really reminded me of a precursor to this sequence in this movie, Blue Bayou. But yeah, that's my favorite scene in the movie, I think, is the dance and the song, and just this entire scene, the lead up to the escape, and everything is great. All of these sequences are wonderful, but this one is so perfectly done. And I think that each time with these first three princesses, Disney outdid themselves with the meeting, because the meeting in Snow White is gorgeous, but it is very simple, it's very basic, it's just, it gets the job done, and you have a beautiful song, and it's very memorable and lovely. In this one, they really ramp it up. They have much more of a sequence. Again, it's nothing insanely flashy, but they have this perfect song, this perfect blue color palette, this shimmering and gorgeous. And then, as we'll get to in Sleeping Beauty, you know, Once Upon a Dream is just, It's the sequence, the song, everything about it.
It's kind of the pinnacle of that, of the prince meeting the princess and falling in love. Like, and I think they knew that they couldn't do it better because they didn't really try after that. And I don't mean that in a rude way. I just mean that
like a sequence like that since, right?
No, there hasn't really been. I mean, again, like things like even in Beauty and the Beast, that's a great sequence, but they're not meeting for the first time, and also they're not even. And I was going to say, and they're not even singing it. It's Angela Lansbury singing it, but I'm saying that sequence isn't when they're meeting. It's more the moment that they fall in love and all that, so.
There's not been a love at first sight moment since Sleeping Beauty, I guess, like that. Like, they've not really tried to do it since. Not a love at first sight. Because Love is an Open Door is a fake out of that. Like, that's turning it on its head. It doesn't happen in Tangled. Like,
in regards to the moment, I agree that what is love is just...
What is love?
And the words are so, like, they're so of their time, but as you said, they're so perfect for what it's trying to imply, which is, again, that it's like a fairy tale where a guy notices this, the prince notices this girl, the girl returns his affection, and it's just this sweep of romance that doesn't feel cheap, and it doesn't feel... It doesn't feel honest. And yes, it's still a fairy tale, and very clearly, that kind of love, you could say doesn't really exist, quote unquote, in the real world. But I guess all I'm saying is that it was still at a time where when you watch it, it feels right, as opposed to a lot of the romantic comedies nowadays when you see the obligatory, guy meets girl and they fall in love within 10 minutes. At least I'm always going, well, I don't really buy this. Like, how are you guys in love already? Whereas in this one... there's something about it that even though it's obviously so quick, you're not saying, well, how is this happening? You're like, oh, yes, this makes so much sense.
Well, I think that you hit on something very interesting there, that love at first sight is an interesting thing to portray because, and the nature of it is an interesting thing to try to put your finger on, because the way I perceive love at first sight is, obviously, you can meet someone, and I think that when there's a moment where two people meet and they're, unattached, at least emotionally, and they have a meeting of their eyes, there are those moments where there's just a recognition of look at you, and there's just this energy there. And then if that can turn into, and this is the thing about meeting somebody spontaneously, meeting somebody at a party, meeting somebody through friends, like it can be meeting somebody at a wedding, like it can be such a moment of, that's why you hear these stories of people meeting and getting married, because they do exist. These stories exist all over the place. It's just that they feel corny because, we've been told that they're corny, and they are corny, but it doesn't mean that they're not real. And so I think what these sequences in these movies represent, especially this one and the one in Sleeping Beauty, but maybe even this one the most in terms of what I'm talking about right now, is that feeling of meeting somebody, both of you being instantly interested and connected, and then just wholeheartedly spending the next few hours together, the next night together, just let's hang out at this party for a few hours, and then the feeling that you walk away from that first meeting with, in terms of just having had that instant connection and knowing that there's something there and knowing that you'll see that person again, that is, I think, the true love at first sight feeling that these sequences and good movies about it portray. And I think that what Disney does with these songs, with these three, and especially this one and the next one, is that they condensed those feelings of several hours spent together, which probably Cinderella and the Prince did spend several hours together, and probably Aurora and Philip did spend several hours in the woods together. But it condenses those feelings down into 2 minutes, into 90 seconds, into 1 minute of just a perfect sequence.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that's very apt and accurate.
Visually, this film is the culmination of everything that the Disney animators had learned during the 1940s and the package film era. But I also want to talk about how many incredibly clever shortcuts the animators were able to employ here. It's basically like, as I alluded to in the opening, it's essentially like a storybook come to life where there's a lot of still shots, slow shots. It's a lot of shots where only a little bit of movement is added, and it's sort of more like you're looking at a painting, and it's just very serene, other than the cat and mouse sequences. But a lot of shots in this movie are very, very just picturesque and slow, especially the ones centered around Cinderella herself. But what that allowed them to do is it allowed them to scrimp and save here on animation here and there and cut little corners and They were able to do that while making this an absolutely gorgeous piece, but there's definitely parts where you can tell that they were doing stuff just because they had to, and just because they had to represent it a certain way to get away with even having the scene in the movie, basically, given the restraints that they were working with and what a financial hole Disney was in at the time and how they were banking on this to do well. And of course they threw a lot of money at it, but again, some corners were cut, and you can tell, and they cut them very intelligently. I have to talk for a second about the iconic and incredibly influential art of Mary Blair in this era in terms of her concept art and color stylings for this movie and for other movies in this era like Peter Pan and Alice in Wonderland especially. It's felt strongly in. She was Walt Disney's personal favorite artist. He trusted her more than anyone in terms of color styling and concept art, and he just absolutely adored her style and her sensibilities. And in my opinion, these two were a dynamic artistic power duo. Like, they were just incredible together. When they put their heads together, they came up with some genius stuff, and I think they adored each other. I think they had an incredibly good relationship, which is kind of why, they created so much good stuff, is that she was one of the people that Walt actually really, really loved and liked being around and genuinely really had a great relationship with. Not that he was this horrible person in person, but he could be really incredibly difficult and had a lot of feuds with people. But he adored Mary Blair. And I think that's cool. Call him what you will, but he certainly wasn't much of a sexist because, as far as I can tell, he respected his female artists and his female employees. He certainly had a lot of female employees, so treated them well. So This Is Love sequence is, I must say, my favorite full scene visually in the film. I just think it's incredible. I think it's so serene and blue, and it just washes over you like this sort of warm water as the song is playing, and it's just something else. It's just wonderful. It's just a beautiful, meditative, gorgeous moment of bliss in the movie. Actress Helene Stanley was hired to stand in for the physical body of Cinderella for this live-action version, allowing the animators to base the movements of the princess on her lovely physical performance. Helene would go on to do the same sort of work again 9 years later as the live-action body reference for Princess Aurora in Sleeping Beauty, as well as 2 years after that for Anita in 101 Dalmatians. This was work that Adriana Caselotti had done for Snow White herself, in addition to already voicing the character. Like Caselotti, Eleanor Audley also pulled double duty in these roles and provided physical reference for the body of Lady Tremaine here. The entire script for the human-focused scenes in Cinderella was shot first in live action, so that the animators could have reference for every single scene involving the humans, and thus work more quickly, as well as other benefits this method can provide. However, it also can provide its own unique challenges, as I shall tell you now. Basically, there's a story about the animator Frank Thomas getting really fed up with the fact that the crew who was shooting the live-action reference that they were going to be using to draw the movie with, they weren't able to do certain camera angles that he would want to, and he essentially said that they told him, well, we can't put the camera there. We can't put the camera way up high here or way over there. We just don't simply have the ability to do that right now. And he said, well, we could put an animated camera there. And he was quite annoyed about this, that they had to scrap certain shot ideas because we can't put the camera there. So the interesting thing about this movie is that it becomes almost like a Scanner Darkly many years later in terms of the human scenes. It becomes this thing where it's an animated movie about human characters, but that sort of functions visually like a live-action film when you're just watching the humans interact. It's this sort of eerie, interesting, beautiful thing that's sort of in the middle. And I will say that of all of the princess characters, I think Cinderella is the least cartoony looking, I think, overall of any Disney princess. She is the most close to the way that a face just moves. And I find that super interesting. Eric Larson and Mark Davis were both tasked with designing and animating Cinderella together. While Larson envisioned the design for Cinderella as a 16-year-old with braids and a pug nose, Davis thought that she should look a bit more statuesque, as he often drew his female characters with a more exotic, swan-necked design. To hash this out, Walt sent in artist Ken O'Brien to split the difference, who, as Larson put it, made my gals and Mark's gals look like the same gal. Due to the live-action reference, the real features of Helene Stanley can also be felt deeply in the final product, and as I've just mentioned, she feels real to me. Our frustrated pal Frank Thomas was assigned with Lady Tremaine, which he found surprising, given his history of work on more endearing characters like Pinocchio and Bambi. Milt Kahl was given the fairy godmother as well as the king and the Grand Duke. Disney had originally wanted the fairy godmother to be tall, regal, and serene, much more like the blue fairy from Pinocchio. However, after the casting of the matronly comedic genius that was Verna Felton in the role, Kahl was able to convince Walt that Verna's particular voice would go way better with a less dignified, less reserved, and far more familiar and jovial portrayal of the now lovingly remembered fairy godmother. The visuals overall are one of this movie's greatest strengths. While corners have definitely been cut as much as possible, as I explained earlier, and many clever shortcuts have been employed, that was all in service of a movie that, while not as visually perfect as something like Sleeping Beauty, is still an absolutely marvelous visual experience every time it is revisited. Walt referred to Cinderella's dress transformation, which was drawn by Mark Davis, as his favorite piece of Disney animation ever.
Yeah, I think I'm higher on it overall than you are, which and that's not to say that I don't, like, when we've talked before and you've mentioned some of your issues with it, I do understand most of them. I think it's just like watching it again, one of the things that stuck out to me was that I was really, like, you could really tell that this was a movie that Disney made kind of at a time when it had come through that, like, challenging years of their of his basically floundering with the studio during World War II, and a lot of his movies had bombed, and this was kind of his last ditch effort to basically save the company. And you can really tell that he threw everything at the screen, like all the money that he had and all the appropriate people that were in place, because it really does look like it's a really beautifully animated film, I will say, especially some of the shots. And like the kind of the iconic shots, like when she transforms like into the ball gown, has the ball gown, or when the slipper is going on the foot, or the ballroom scene with her and the prince. Like, it's really, and that's the other thing, by the way, is I had seen a couple of Pixar films before this, or no, one Pixar film and one Disney film that was like 3D animation that came out in the mid 2010s. And it isn't to say that 3D animation can't be really good and doesn't still have its moments, but there is something about 2D animation that is just so timeless and really doesn't age if it's done well. Like, it literally, like, it doesn't mean that this doesn't have moments where maybe you can tell that it's old, but overall, if you show this, or you show one of their, like The Lion King, like 45 years later, it doesn't really look all that different. Whereas if you show someone The Incredibles, the film that came out in 2004, I think the film is great, but like you can tell that the CG like animation is like not held up well just because of technology improvements and stuff like that. And so that's the other thing about all these old Disney films, but especially Cinderella, is the 2D animation is just A, so good, but B, it's so timeless. It has just such a timeless feel to it.
Absolutely. Well, and by this time, Disney had been able to perfect their animation of men, which was a big problem for them in the late 30s and early 40s, and something that they worked on a lot throughout the 40s, but these animators had a big problem doing men, which was basically the entire reason why the prince had such a tiny part in Snow White. They just found animating realistic men super difficult, and so by the time we get to Cinderella in 1950, we have the prince played straight, but then we have the king and the duke, or whatever he is, played comically. And so we've got both together, and they're both done really well. That by 1950, and going into this period that lasted essentially until Walt's death, but at least until the 60s when they stopped putting as much money into their films. But throughout the 1950s, they had reached this peak with their visuals. And going forward with the next four films,
and I was going to say, and with that, just along with what you're saying, I would say that it really reached its peak. Like, I would say this was the start of the peak, but it really reached the peak with Sleeping Beauty. Like, I think we would both say that, like this was the start of, like, the animators feeling very confident, and then Sleeping Beauty, I think I've mentioned before that in one of the special features that I saw once upon a time of Sleeping Beauty, they literally mention that, like, while they were doing it, they could tell that they were like light years ahead of their time, which is really weird to hear animators say. And they didn't say it in like a egotistical way, but they basically said like, we could tell when we were doing this that this was something very, very special, which is I think always cool when like filmmakers or people working on a film like know that they're making something great. And not that with Cinderella, just to bring it back to Cinderella, not that with Cinderella they also didn't think that as well. But I think it was different because, again, this was, like I was saying before, was at a time where legitimately people didn't know how this was going to go. They were bankrupt almost, and, like, Disney was doing this as kind of a, come on, audiences, like, you still like, you know, me, right? But he didn't really know. And once this was such a huge mass success, then they were able to go, oh, okay, wait a minute, yes, now we have something again.
And now it's time for the Critics Roundup, which is a segment of these videos that I like to take out and basically look at the rankings of, in this case, I think 22 other reviewers and rankers who put together a list of their, rank of the Disney animated classics, and I tell you where they rank them, what they thought of them, if there were thoughts, very, very briefly summarized, and then what the average was, and here we go. L.S. Mark. L.S. Mark didn't do the package film era, so we're back to L.S. Mark here on the list every time. Yay. Hello, L.S. Mark. L.S. Mark, 27th. Loves Lady Tremaine and Cinderella herself. Likes all the Cinderella stuff. Loves the animation, but thinks there's way too much mouse stuff and that it ends up being just okay overall. Shafrillis Productions, 52nd. Says this isn't a very good Cinderella adaptation. Says it is mostly just mice dicking around. Sean Chandler, 6th, says it's a classic and perfectly told fairy tale and underdog story, loves the mice, and calls it the definitive Cinderella adaptation. Brian Hull, 30th, enjoys it fine, says that the mice save it for him. Interesting. Okay. I really like Brian Hull, though he's cool. The Trove, 12th, praises Cinderella and Tremaine. The music and animation says it has too much of the cat and mouse stuff. I like every reviewer on this list, by the way. They're all cool. Dave Lee Down Under, 16th, says it is enchanting and captivating with a great story and art. Modern Mouse, 6th, calls it one of the best. The 90s Kid, 1st to 8th. The Glad in Gladiator, 27th, says it's easily A tier, says he loves it so much. Chris Itua, 32nd, says it feels like Disney personified, and the only big problem is the fairly shallow story. Maple Street Movies, 49th, says he isn't that big a fan, and that when he rewatched it for his list, he was a bit bored. The Movie Geek, 53rd, says that Eileen Woods did as well as she could with a weak script, but that he actively hated her performance as Cinderella. Oh my goodness.
Damn!
Anyway, we can always count on the Movie Geek to give us something really cutting for for our little blurb there. Anyway, that was the YouTube critics, and now it's on to the online critics, who historically I think have been a little bit more into these older Disney films. They're a little bit more snooty and a little older generations, and that's totally fine. We love that too. We love that energy, okay. Collider, 19th, talks pretty negatively, criticizes Cinderella as a boring film, and calls the film adequate. Yeah, if your 19th is just adequate, that's interesting, Collider. You don't really actually like Disney animated movies that much overall. Unshaved Mouse, 44th, says that it isn't bad, but that it feels very safe, not as daring as the tar and sugar era films before the war, and feels designed to appeal to the widest possible audience. Cinema Blend, 23rd, says that while lovely, this film is a mixed bag, and the mice pull too much focus away from the main characters. Hollywood.com, 9th, says that even more so than Snow White, Cinderella is really the inceptive example of Disney magic, and that it contains the kind of fun that has come to define the best of Disney. Paste Magazine, 14th, calls it the real deal and says it's one of the best animated movies ever. Slash Film, 18th, says that it is in some ways a step up from Snow White, but overall isn't as daring. Screen Rant, 36th, says that it's visually stunning and one of the best hand-drawn movies ever. but that it is a little dated and that the live-action remake is way better. The Playlist, 25th, says it's absolutely solid and often very beautiful, but not as clever as some of the other fairy tales from Disney. Noah Fryman, 17th, says that it's arguably the most iconic movie Disney has ever made, and that it has everything you'd want a great Disney movie to have. Darth Docking on Reddit, 5th. 22 reviews and rankings, with its highest ranking being 5th, and 0 first-place finishes, obviously. 5 rankers putting it in their top 10, and 16 out of the 22 putting it in their top 30, or top half, basically. They gave it an average ranking of 23.8th, or just under 24th. Coming in at 5th on our list so far, just under Fantasia and right above Dumbo. The first film yet to penetrate what had been the so far exclusively tar and sugar era-dominated top 5.
And I think that's the other thing about these early movies that they did, is that they were so good at being, and when I say being short, I simply mean that they didn't drag on. Like, this movie is an hour and 15 minutes, and it's perfect for that. And that's one of the reasons, and I think we differ on this like slightly, but that's one of the reasons why personally for so many of the Disney remakes that they've done, why I don't like them near as much, is that they add like sometimes 45 minutes to the film. And while there is definitely in some of them, there is definitely some sequences that you go, oh wow, that was good and that added something, etc. In a lot of their movies, a lot of it, you're going like, what? Why is this in here? And what do you like? Come on, like just tell the story. Because again, as you said, you know, someone could say, oh, well, you know what, I'm going to recreate that Cinderella and Prince moment, but I'm going to add 15 minutes on to like show more. And I guarantee you people would go, no, we don't need that. It was distilled, as you said, down into this 1.5 minute, 2-minute song so perfectly that we don't need that. And so I think that, yeah, it's these movies that like were kind of from the beginning, like with Snow White, and then going up till, I guess I would kind of say up until Walt Disney died, really, with maybe like 101 Dalmatians. Like, I don't think any of them were over like 75, 80 minutes, 85 minutes. And then once...
The longest runtime of any of these is around 83 minutes. I know it was Sleeping Beauty 75 minutes.
Okay, right, and that's...
They're pretty short.
Yeah, exactly, and that's what this one was as well, yeah. And then it was kind of like after Walt died, and maybe it wasn't immediately after, but obviously things started to get longer, and I think that's one of the reasons why we love a lot of the Renaissance films, like, you know, Little Mermaid and Lion King and Aladdin and all those, because while those are maybe a little longer, they're still under an hour and a half. Like, they're an hour and 25 minutes, maybe an hour and 20 minutes, and again, it's, you know, as I've said before, it's always about the length to tell the story. Some stories you need 2.5, 3 hours, you know, or more to tell the story, but some stories you don't. And if you don't need any more than an hour and 15 minutes, there was a time, like with Cinderella, where the creators working on it said, okay, we're done. But now it seems like if you're working on a film that's an hour and 25 minutes and the story's done, that creators are starting to go, well, wait a minute, no, we need to pad the runtime and add more, and what else can we tell? And it's like, if the story's done, then it's done. You know what I'm saying?
I agree, and I think it's interesting because there's always sequences that you hear about that they cut from these movies. So they, you know, a lot of them would have been 10 minutes longer, 15 minutes longer, or maybe even just like 5-8 minutes longer. You know, I know there's a few scenes that they cut out of Sleeping Beauty. I know that there's several sequences they cut from Snow White, especially since there were a few scenes of the men that they'd cut. Like there was the whole plot of Philip being captured in Sleeping Beauty that's just used leftover from It Was Gonna Happen to the Prince and Snow White. And so they knew what to cut. They knew what to cut back then. They knew what was essential. And sometimes you honestly wish that these movies had even been a little bit longer because they're so great. Like they could stand to be a bit longer because they are pretty much on the shorter side. But that's okay because it's great to have a great movie that only takes 75 minutes to watch. Also, kids have short attention spans. Like, it is good for kids' movies to be about as short as they can be. And these are all ages movies that are explicitly aimed at being enjoyable for kids, even though they are all ages movies. They're meant to be timeless pieces of art, but certainly they're meant to be enjoyable for kids. And so, yeah, I love a concise story in animation. I love something that just gets to the basics and does those basics as perfectly as they can be done.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, one other thing just to mention, like I was almost like crying as I was listening to the opening song, "A Dream Is a Wish Your Heart Makes," not just because it's such a lovely song, but any time now that I hear that song, I'm always thinking of the fact that the actress who voiced her, Eileen Woods, is the one that in her later years died of Alzheimer's when I think she was 81. And one of the things that people always said was so sad was in her like last few years she didn't remember playing Cinderella anymore, but yet the nurses said that whenever they would come and would play that song, like of her singing "A Dream Is a Wish Your Heart Makes," like on the radio or whatever it was, basically she would like smile and she would like get this little like, you know, like joy in her eye again. And so there's just something about hearing, and she was also, the other thing is she was young when she did this movie. I didn't realize that she was like 20 when she made this movie. So a lot of times that's the thing about these new movies is, you know, we're watching princesses that are clearly supposed to be like 16 to 18 years old, but they're being voiced by like 35-year-old women. And I'm not trying to make it seem as if that's inherently bad. I just mean that it's interesting that in this time, like there was literally a girl that was 20 who was voicing like a 16-year-old maybe or something like that. And so it was a lot closer. But yeah, just the sadness of, you know, watching someone who created something so iconic and then in her later years, you know, kind of through no fault of her own was, you know, feeling like she was being forgotten.
I agree. No, that's terribly sad, and I'm glad that brought her joy, and she has brought us joy for over 7 decades. So what a lovely woman. Any final thoughts? Any areas that we haven't discussed? Anything you want to say before I ask you for your final rating?
I guess I'll just say this, to summarize, the biggest things that stand out to me in this film are the animation, which, as we kind of have been talking about, this is kind of the time where you could really tell that the animation was reaching the peak of what the Walt Disney Company could do. And B, I think that the songs that are in it, specifically So This Is Love and A Dream Is a Wish Your Heart Makes, are like some of the very best that Disney's ever done. I think that a lot of the comedy really does work and is great. Some of it doesn't hit, and I think the things that keep it from being like one of their masterpieces is the stepsisters and the stepmom and kind of how they work. Some of the jokes don't land, and then obviously the mice, while again they're entertaining, it kind of delves too much into them. So yeah, that would be my thoughts, I think.
And so what is your rating out of you give 100-point scale?
Yeah, I can do it out of 10. I mean, out of my scale, I've given it 85 out of 100, or on your scale, it would be 8.5 out of 10. Now when I'm looking, it's in actually my top 20 is what it's in for me. So I'll just say that right now. I don't want to give an exact number because, as you said, I want to kind of leave like some of it. But it's in my top 20. It's possible that some of these could shift because, again, unlike you, I haven't watched all of these like immediately as I'm viewing them. But I'm guessing that it won't drop below 25 and it won't go above like 15. So it'll be somewhere between, like, I would say 15 to 25. But right now it's in the top 20.
As I've said before in this review in this D.E.A.R, this is a simple movie, the simplest and purest of the princess films. While Snow White was the blueprint of the princess archetype, Cinderella is Disney's purest distillation of it. A tale of neglect, a tale of abuse, a tale of magic, whimsy, and of true love triumphing at long last, and most of all, a tale of dreams coming true. The human portions of this film are honestly uniformly pretty great. They might not rank in the top 10, but the human portions of this movie are absolutely charming and entertaining, if quite simple often. There isn't a lot to this story, and that shows in where it spends its time. While there are many subtle or silly, clever or thought-provoking scenes throughout the movie, such as Cinderella's 2 songs, Lady Tremaine's screen time, or anything with the King and the Grand Duke, there is almost as much screen time devoted to mice doing mouse nonsense. This is not a long movie to begin with, as I've noted earlier. It is 74 minutes without credits, and about 26 of those minutes, 35%, is focused directly on either Cinderella interacting with the mice specifically, or, more often, the mice on their own. Ultimately, while the sheer percentage of mouse nonsense does hurt this movie in the end, the simplicity and sweetness of the rest of the film won me over, and I'd say I'm somewhat of a fan of Cinderella now. I'm certainly a much bigger fan of her as a character, and her place in the Disney princess lineage. I'll probably be dropping a princess ranking video eventually soon too, although that'll be a beast to edit. Oof. She's a strong, kind, and truly empathetic character. She has easily one of the most beautiful vocal performances of any of them, and character designs, and her songs are absolutely splendid. I think perhaps that since this movie came out so early in Disney's history and was given prime placement as the beginning of their third era and their return to narrative and princess storytelling, that this film has been able to enjoy a somewhat too generous reputation, historically speaking. Not that it isn't still good, beautiful, lovely to listen to, and frequently visually sublime, but there is simply a lot that Disney has made since that has equaled or far surpassed the experience of this film as a whole. I think that its prime 1950 release spot, initial critical and financial success at the time, and sheer oldness nowadays have all contributed to this being a somewhat overrated Disney classic when judged up against a lot of the rest of the canon. However, at least in my opinion, I think it's okay to acknowledge that Cinderella as a character might now, in the modern day, be a bit more important of an ambassador for the Disney brand than the actual overall quality of her original film really justifies. Either way, a lovely little movie and a still solid Disney classic. A very well-earned 7 out of 10. Good job.
Great job.
And that's it. Next week, we'll be back and looking at 1951's Alice in Wonderland, so please do join me for that as well. Thank you for watching, and if you're still here, good night, good luck, and enjoy the afterword.
Beautiful melodies,
towering symphonies,
music so gorgeous your life fades from view.
Days in the sun
and nights on the run,
they can't compare to a moment with you. You're not what I thought you'd be.
I didn't expect to see
someone like you looking my way tonight. Is this how it feels
when something is real?
I was in darkness till you brought the light. Hold me close and kiss me tonight.
Save me and love me, I've done nothing right.
You're the one,
Console all my pain. Be here forever or just for today. Take my hand, sing with me, longer than eternity. Far beyond the narrow make your life what you want it to be. I think I've always known,
I've never been less alone.
like every day has been leading to this. We've wasted years
Imprisoned by fears,
waiting for something too perfect to miss. Hold me close and kiss me tonight. Save me and love me, I've done nothing right. You're the one, console all my pain. Be here forever or just for today.
I'm shaking now as we touch.
The warmth of you means so much. Every desire now finally. You heard my song.
I missed you so long.
That's all.